And Stanley, you shared the handouts as well?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone. We'll take another minute or so just as everybody trickles in.
Bienvenidos a todos. En un momento comenzaremos mientras lleguen los demás.
Okay, great. Well, we'll welcome folks now and just say, welcome back everybody to our third and final capacity building training called Granted, the Architecture of Grant Seeking for Progressive Social Change.
Bienvenidos otra vez en lo que llegan los demás. Les damos bienvenida a nuestra tercera sesión de Con Fondos, la arquitectura de la búsqueda de fondos para el cambio social progresista.
And I'd like to first again introduce our Spanish-English language interpreter, Naira Pacheco, we just heard, and she will guide us through how to access our interpretation for today.
Y me gustaría presentar a nuestra intérprete al español que nos guiará a través de algunas instrucciones para conectar hoy. Hola, buenos días a todos. Mi nombre es Naira Pacheco. Esta sesión será interpretada del inglés al español. Igual, si usted gusta comunicar sus preguntas o comentarios en inglés o español, siéntase libre de hacerlo. Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Naira Pacheco, and I will be interpreting today's session from English to Spanish. If you would like to communicate any of your questions or comments in either language, please feel free to do so. En algunos momentos, cuando activemos la función de interpretación, van a ver aparecer un icono de globo en la pantalla al fondo y a la derecha. Y usted podrá hacer clic aquí y hacer selección del idioma en el que prefiere escuchar y comunicarse en este espacio. Y si por algún motivo durante la sesión se le hace difícil escuchar el audio del intérprete sobre el audio original, en cualquier momento también puede seleccionar la opción de silenciar el audio original para solo oír la voz del intérprete. Si usted está conectado por un dispositivo móvil o celular, usted puede hacer clic en los tres puntitos hacia el fondo y a la derecha de la pantalla. Igual seleccionar su idioma y también tiene la opción de silenciar el audio original. In just a few moments, when we activate interpretation, you will see a globe icon appear at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You will be able to click on that and select the language that you want to connect in this space. If you at any point cannot hear the audio of the interpreter over the original audio, then you can select mute original audio and you will only hear the interpreter's rendering. Si usted es bilingüe, usted puede escoger cualquier canal que guste o se puede quedar en la sala principal. If you're bilingual, you can choose either channel that you'd like or you can stay in the main floor. Si en algún momento tiene problemas conectando con la interpretación, favor de dejarnos saber en el chat y ya sea yo o Stanley le podemos ayudar. So if at any moment you have any issues with the interpretation function, please let us know through the chat and myself or Stanley can help you troubleshoot. And so ya vamos a activar la función de interpretación. Favor de darnos un minuto para comenzar. We will now activate interpretation and please give us a minute to connect.
Great, thank you, Naida, and I'll go ahead and enable that now. And Naida, let me know if that seems to be working. Sure. Okay, thank you for bearing with us. So go ahead and reshare my screen. And we'll go ahead and get started again by an important land acknowledgement. So please remember that we are on Chumash land. So before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to the Chumash elders, past, present, and future, who call this place, the land that Santa Barbara sits upon, their home. We are honored to be guests upon this land and are proud to continue their tradition of coming together and growing as a community. We thank the Chumash community for their stewardship and support. We look forward to strengthening our ties as we continue our relationship with mutual respect and understanding. Thank you again to Mia Lopez, a member of the Coastal Band of the Chumash Nation, for this thoughtful and important land acknowledgement. And so today I'd like to guide us through a very brief grounding exercise, just to kind of make us present. And grounding exercises I find are a really helpful tool we can use when we feel anxious or if our minds are racing. It can bring us back to the here and now, and is a very helpful tool in managing overwhelming feelings and calming us down and really just getting us centered in a sense of place. So I'd like you to first just stop and take one slow, mindful, deep breath. And then I'd like to ask you to look at two things in your environment. Pick one thing and just really focus on seeing it. Notice its textures, the lighting, its shape. Really notice the details. And then look at another item so that you're flexibly choosing to shift your attention to another object and focus on that as well. Notice its textures, how the light reflects off of it, its shape. And finally, listen to 3 sounds in your environment. Shift your attention to the little details of those sounds, volume, the tone, the pitch. When you're ready, please take one final breath and come back to us. Great, thank you to my coworker, Tanya, who's been guiding us through these during some of our meetings, and it's been very helpful. So now I'm excited to reintroduce our 3 wonderful panelists: Rachel Johnson, Jennifer Navarro, Suzanne Valerie. Most of you all now have joined us for one or both sessions. And I'm excited that they're again sharing their insight, decades of experience in grant writing and supporting social change organizations. Again, I encourage you to read more about them on our landing page. And I'm excited about the last third of our workshop series. And I'll go ahead and hand that off to you, Suzanne.
Thank you, folks, for coming back, being here. Hopefully you did have a chance to attend or watch the first 2 sessions where we've covered all but the last of our learning objectives. Today, we're going to talk about conveying your impact on social change. In other words, we're talking about evaluation. And I'm going to give you an overview of what evaluation is and how to use it. We could go to the next slide. Oh, well, actually, here are the 3 topics that we're going to cover today. I'll give the overview, and Rachel will give you tools and methods, and Jennifer will talk about how to demonstrate the impact in your overall goals.
Suzanne, sorry to jump in here just a moment. If we could just take a moment really quickly to work on an IT issue really quickly. Okay, please go ahead. Thanks for your patience.
Can you advance the slides? So basically, evaluation begins with a good program design. As you may recall from what we've talked about so far, everything starts with your whole narrative flows in a linear process from identifying the need and then identifying the objectives to address the need. And now, if you've established milestones and measurable objectives, you come to demonstrating or determining the effectiveness of all of this program planning when you're doing your evaluation. So you really want to use evaluation to learn what works and also how to integrate this program into the organizational planning for the future. Essentially, evaluation is in determining the value, the worth, the merit of what you set out ahead of time and what you're prepared to do and how it's going to impact your overall social change effort. And of course, you then obviously have the opportunity to use this data, use this information to strengthen your future fundraising and future funding requests. The purpose of evaluation is really quite multiple. So yes, you want to collect the data to show what's working, but also to help you figure out what you need to modify and improve. And evaluation also helps you to see that there may be, and most likely are, some unintended circumstances that you weren't aware of ahead of time. You've learned some things in the process that you didn't know. Then you want to confirm that your activities are operating as you intended. You're looking at your activities as you're going on because you don't want to wait till the end to realize that you went off course and didn't have a chance to course correct. So you want to be able to improve what you're doing. And eventually to understand the impact of these activities, not only on the participants, but on the organization itself, and ultimately on the community. You want to be able to demonstrate that you're changing things for the better. Usually evaluation starts with questions. You want to know, these are what you want to know, why you're doing the evaluation. When we think of evaluation in both process and outcome terms, sometimes you'll see the terms formative and summative evaluation. They say that when the chef tastes the soup, that's formative. When the participants taste the soup, that's summative. So the process evaluation questions are the things that you need to know about how you're conducting your activities to make sure that you're doing things as planned and staying on target. So you could ask, are your outreach strategies being employed effectively? Is the staff appropriately qualified and trained? How's the management of the project going? Things like that that will help you correct if you need to as you're going along. Whereas outcome questions are about the intended consequences. And did the project meet its goals? And also, were the results worth the cost of the program? And can you sustain the program? And ultimately, can other organizations learn and use what you have done and integrate it into their programs? We like to think of participatory evaluation because, I've said this a couple of times that you want to build in feedback loops before, during, and after the project. Well, you might ask, well, how do we get feedback before the project even starts? Well, you could have focus groups with potential participants. You could be gaining input from various stakeholders that goes into helping you design what the program is that you're going to be doing. So this paper that I've referenced here, considering evaluation, they talk about participatory evaluation in this definition. By providing stakeholders opportunities to shape the evaluation questions, define success, analyze the learning, and decide what to do with the findings brings people into a more powerful role related to the work. So you're engaging all your stakeholders in the process, and everybody is learning, and you're adding to the body of knowledge in your sector. So you might be asking yourself some more questions in order to consider this learning opportunity. Who are your stakeholders? Now, you might think of your stakeholders as the program participants, but your stakeholders are also your staff. They're also your board. They're also other people in the community, other people who work in your sector. So you've got a variety of stakeholders that you can be engaging in your work. And making sure that you engage them in a way that reflects your social justice values. Very transparent and democratic processes. And you want to make sure that your participants are embracing the program. And if you have a reason to believe that there may be a gap there, then that's something for you to address. You also want to be documenting and communicating your program's value to other groups that work in your sector. And again, you need to determine, you're using evaluation to determine if your outcomes are cost-effective and sustainable. So what is a sustainability plan? Many funders will ask you how you plan to sustain the program after the project period of the grant, after the funding ends. Well, and they probably don't want to hear, well, we're just going to write more grants and raise money. They know you're going to do that. You want to show that you can integrate the program as an essential aspect of your work going forward. You can think of it this way. When you identify the needs, you're basically saying there's a gap somewhere in solving this problem. And we are going to put together this program that weaves together the fabric to make this hole go away, to create a solid fabric for this. And then you have to sustain that going forward because that has addressed the problem. You can, in your statement, in your narrative, in your sustainability plan, you can highlight that you have considerable support in the community, not only from community members and donors, from other grant makers, and this is essential to demonstrate in some ways. You can name those supporters, organizations, and so on that you affiliate with. And also you can address in this section how you plan to use evaluation results to guide future program planning. That's also important because that is what you're going to be doing. Sustaining the effort is going to be about using the information to plan your future course. Evaluations offer insights into the impact and such factors as feasibility and replicability. Is it feasible for some other organization to take this on? Is it feasible for your organization to maintain it? And can other organizations replicate what you've done? The US Department of Labor defines sustainability this way: ensuring that the goals of the project continue to be met through activities that are consistent with the current conditions and resources that are available. This is important because it's saying that, yes, you want to maintain the goals that you started with, but after you're doing these evaluations, your conditions, the conditions may have changed, or hopefully they have changed, because otherwise, what was the impact that you're making? And so you reassess to determine what you're going to need to do to go forward. Here's how you can think about this. You can start by reviewing the data, as I'm always going to say that, what worked and what needs modification, and refine your goals and objectives and your program design based on these current conditions. You may find that your objectives need to be restated. And review the outcomes that you initially set out. Are they still relevant? I have often found that in designing a program or writing these outcome objectives, often they're much more aspirational than they turn out to have been realistic. So now you can reassess and look at your current conditions and resources, and look at how you're going to restate your outcomes. Now, just a word about sustainability after you do the outcome evaluation. Again, you're using data to make these future decisions about future activities. You're always relying on the evidence, and it's not always just numerical. You know, you've got qualitative data, you've got input from your stakeholders and staff. Identify your resources, in other words, do another budget, and consider that you may be able to get resources to meet your needs other than money. Look at your whole array of options for meeting the need. And you could consider writing a value statement to use in marketing and fundraising. A value statement is just essentially like a one-pager. State who you are, what you do, what your goals and objectives are for this program, what you've accomplished, and what you need going forward. And you can use this to pitch for donors and marketing and fundraising. Essentially, what you want to be doing is identifying champions for your cause. That's the best way to sustain your program. And now Rachel will take you through some of the nuts and bolts and tools and methods for evaluations.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. So we got an overview now of sort of why evaluation, what does evaluation and sustainability mean when it comes up in grant applications. Next slide, please, Stanley. So what I'm going to do now is look at a couple things, zeroing in on some of the general concepts that Suzanne just talked about. So we're going to start with a look at data. She mentioned that a couple of times. Data is generally a very important part of evaluation. So we're going to look at data in relation to evaluation efforts and equity initiatives in particular. Then look at some specific data collection methods. So what actually makes up that evaluation plan that Suzanne just went through? What are your options if you're starting from scratch, thinking through how to evaluate your program? And then I'm going to end with a small section on logic models. Logic models are just a particular tool that you'll probably see come up in grant applications. It lends itself to really helping with evaluation, because it really ends up being a visual summary of an entire grant application and your entire theory of change. So just looking at that as a particular tool to help think through these. Next slide. Okay, so much like my first section in workshop 1, I want to kind of start with a quotation that kind of gets us in a mindset to talk about data and kind of some big picture conversations around data and evaluation. This quote on the slide is by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it's from Between the World and Me, sort of short book that comprised a letter that he wrote to his son about living in this world. So I kept the full quotation, but I'm going to zero in on the last sentence there, but I'll read it for you. It's hard to face this, but all our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions, all land with great violence upon the body. And I just love that last line whenever I'm talking about getting into the weeds with things like data and program evaluation, to remember that whenever we look at big social change issues or big societal problems and try to boil them down into numbers, really distances that from the really lived experience of whatever those issues and problems are. So I want you to keep that in mind when we talk about data and when you start thinking through how to collect data about your programs and how to present to other people how you evaluate their successes, that ultimately all numbers are not neutral. Just like we discussed with budgets in the last workshop, budgets are value statements, and so are numbers and data. And so as we move forward with this section, just keep that in mind, that data, and perhaps even more importantly, data collection, are not neutral. They're always going to be subjective, even when they appear, or some people want to believe that they're objective. Couple definitions too, as we move forward. We're going to talk about the difference between quantitative versus qualitative data. And a really simple distinction between those is quantitative is going to deal with numbers and statistics, whereas qualitative deals with words, meanings, and experiences. And it's important to remember, especially in equity work, social justice work, grassroots movements, that both of these are kinds of data. They're kinds of research and methodologies that, that arrive at quantitative and qualitative data. So their value, one over the other, is really subjective and very contextual. So in the grant world, especially in the areas like federal grants or public funding, you'll find an emphasis on quantitative data, but qualitative data is still part of sort of the same data world and shouldn't be devalued. So the limitations of particularly quantitative data, the reason why I want to make that distinction really clear is that one of the big conversations in the funding world and in philanthropy is this question of what are the limitations of traditional models of evaluation on equity initiatives in particular. And one of my favorite things about this workshop series is how much we've gotten into the big picture questions in Q&A and really talked through how to shift a lot of the assumptions and traditional methods of the grant world. And this is definitely one of them. So Part of the resources that we've made available to you, and I think Stanley might drop it in the chat as well. There's an article in the Chronicle for Philanthropy about Geraldine Coffey, and she is the director of the Equity Evaluation Initiative. Look her up if you're interested in reading about evaluation and equity. It's a relatively new organization, just launched in 2017. So that gives you an idea of how recent of a new conversation this is within the grant world, sort of like trust-based philanthropy, which we talked about last time. These are new conversations, and that's actually really exciting when we talk about how to help your organizations be part of that conversation through your own grant seeking. So she's one of the main figures doing this work to challenge the way that foundations and other funders measure success and ask their grantees to measure their own success. And kind of like I summarized earlier, she criticizes this reliance on statistical data, the valuing of quantitative data, to boil down really nuanced and messy social problems. It doesn't really make sense to address really complicated issues and then try to oversimplify them when you get to the evaluation phase by using concrete numbers and statistics. So I'm sure if you've had conversations, depending on the variety of work that you all do, the participants in this workshop, that hopefully resonates, right? You are tackling really huge systemic societal issues, and it's not always easy to boil those down to numbers. And numbers that can just easily convince someone of the need, the problem you're solving, and the fact that you're doing it well. Two big problems that Dean Coffey's work points out, and I just want to make you aware of them, are the world of evaluation often emphasizes a number of oppressive assumptions, similar to the ones that we talked about in the first workshop. One of them with evaluation is this idea that all programs should have external evaluators or people who have doctoral level credentials to come in and easily be able to assess technically the success of your program. So that's an assumption that there are evaluators as people out there who have the ability and the right to come in and do that kind of work while not necessarily being involved in the work itself. And another one that she brings up is the fact that when you're asked to do an evaluation as part of your work with a foundation or a funder, they often require your evaluation to produce information that they want to use. So they want to say, we supported this program that decreased recidivism rates for formerly incarcerated students by X%. And that's the funder using that data to celebrate its own work, rather than emphasizing the data collected being useful for the organization doing the work and for the people who are being served. So there's also this fundamental assumption that evaluation and data collection is for the funder rather than the organization doing the work. So the oppressive assumptions that we've now talked about on a number of occasions throughout the workshop, the question always comes up, what is the alternative? So what do we hope to see happen in the grant seeking and grant making world? A couple options, and we'll go through some of these, is using qualitative data alongside quantitative. And when we get to the tools and collection methods, we'll see which ones gather which types of information. And ultimately sort of spinning qualitative into quantitative. So if a funder requires quantitative data on some point related to your project, but you feel like you have the capacity to only collect qualitative data, then the way you present that data can make make connections or sort of blur the lines between the two. And we'll see that a bit more when we get into the actual methods. So ultimately, like a number of these conversations, we want to help you as grant seekers work within the system while challenging and dismantling it by asking questions, presenting your work in specific ways and intentional ways. One way to do this with evaluation is in your applications, while you're putting together the evaluation plan, the sustainability plan that Suzanne went over, be transparent about your experience with data and evaluation. Wherever possible, talk to your funders, even ahead of time if you have a relationship with them, about your own organizational limitations or capacity to do data collection work or evaluation, and encourage, if possible, encourage the funder to partner with you. There are huge foundations that give money all over the place that have full departments devoted to evaluation and devoted to using data for their own use, for their own purposes. And those are exactly the foundations that should become partners with their grantees and actually provide that assistance and that expertise in data collection. And I think, again, in this context, the fund is a great organization to call out in terms of its the technical assistance and capacity building that the fund tries to offer its grant seekers, its grantees, and the community at large in our county to provide this kind of assistance, not always directly helping with data collection, but connecting potential grant seekers with other resources to help with that. I also want to, before moving on, acknowledge, I think Jen's comment in the Q&A of workshop 2, I believe it came up, on how, and maybe this was a discussion we had outside of the actual workshop, but we've talked about how even the idea of helping you spin qualitative data into quantitative data, or work to fit your evaluation ideas into what the funder wants, is in and of itself working within the system rather than changing it. So be aware, ultimately we want to see the system change, but for the time being, to get the funds you need now, this is another system of evaluation and data that we need to learn to work within. All right, so the next slide, what I'm going to do is go through 6 different data collection methods that you might use to gather information to evaluate your program. It's organized on a bit of a spectrum from the most impersonal methods to ones that are more relational in the way that they're conducted. So as I go through these, think about which ones feel like they would come up with quantitative data and which ones would lead to more qualitative data, and why that is. And it might be tempting here, the way I've laid them out, to see these methods as also going from objective to more subjective. But as we go through all of them, I also want you to keep in mind that all of these methods are going to have subjective pieces to them. There's always going to be bias present, and that is something to just be aware of. And even as we talk about objective methods that sort of produce a more scientifically accepted data set. So on the first slide here, you'll see the first method is documentation review. So this is, you might have a set of documents about a program. So applications that were written for types of funding, information given to potential donors, finances, memos. It could include minutes of meetings or board minutes. And the purpose of this methodology is really to just gather impressions about a program through looking through documents that already exist. So there's no specific intervention. It's just what documents exist and how do we look through them for information. So the advantages to this, one of them is that that information does already exist. And you don't have to produce new information necessarily or have someone else produce it for you. It can be a way to get historical and comprehensive information if there's lots of documentation available. You don't have to interrupt a program or create an intervention within a program. And it is ostensibly objective. These are documents that were not created with the purpose of being used in program evaluation. So in that sense, they might have fewer biases about the program that you're looking at because they weren't created with that intentional purpose. One of the advantages is also a challenge. The fact that it's information that already exists means it's limited to what already exists. It's also very time consuming to go through data. Information might be incomplete because, again, it wasn't created for the purpose of program evaluation necessarily. And if you want to do this, you'll really need to have a clear plan or approach and some staff time and staff dedication to do it. And then again, a challenge is that, biases still exist within existing documents. And an added layer of difficulty might be that you'll need to look even harder to excavate those biases. A similar, more academic method of data collection would be case studies. And this is a way to look at a program or participant experience in comparison to a comparable program or project. And again, this is ostensibly objective. It's looking at, here's a set of information about a program, its inputs, its processes. Here were the results. Let's compare it to the results of another similar program. And case studies are ones that tend to be very well represented in academia. It's a scientific, an accepted scientific method of looking at a variety of things that have a similar set of circumstances. So if you have to explain a program to third parties who might not be familiar, sometimes comparative examples are really helpful. Like documentation review, it's very time consuming. It's basically doing academic research. It's like a school book report. It can really take time to analyze and then write out results of case study analysis. Depending on the area in which you work, you might not have a lot of comparative examples to look at. If you're, delving into something that's a relatively new area, that can be difficult. And then you might end up dealing with questions about depth versus breadth. So because how time-consuming case studies can be, you probably can't do 50 different case studies to compare with one another. So you'll lose breadth, but maybe dive deeply into one or two examples. So those are two academic methods. The next slide has two that I'm calling transactional methods. The first one here is probably one most people are familiar with: questionnaires, surveys, or checklists. The purpose of these is to get lots of information from a variety of people. You can do this with large numbers of people in a pretty quick and efficient way, and also a non-threatening way. Often surveys are just emailed out and people have the choice whether or not to do them. The advantages are they can be anonymous. That's really important, I think, with social change work. I think recently my organization just did a survey and we wanted to ask a question about whether or not people responding were AB 540 students or otherwise undocumented. And there's a big trust concern with asking questions like that. So we wanted to make it clear that the survey was anonymous, and let participants know how we were being intentional about not wanting them to feel that was inappropriate for them to share, or that they'd have to be scared of sharing that information. It's inexpensive. Anyone can do free Google Forms. It's pretty efficient. You can email it out to an entire email list. Once you get data back, if it's Google Forms, you will get a spreadsheet that's automatically generated with responses. So it can be easy to compare and analyze. You can get lots of data because you could ask however many questions you want on a form. And there's lots of templates and examples out there on the internet for you to start with. Some of the challenges with this, though, access considerations. So you have to assume that the people you want to reach have email addresses, have computers if it's going to be an online survey, have internet access. You might need partners for that. Efforts around the census, when the census goes primarily digital, you have to enlist partners to really help that work. Another challenge is you might not get really substantive feedback unless you want to include big pros boxes in the survey, and people might just do the checklist part and not spend a lot of time on the other information, please describe box. So you're not going to get maybe as full of a story as you might want. The biases with this one are somebody is writing the questions. So the wording of questions might lead people to respond in a certain way. It's impersonal, getting an email survey definitely doesn't feel very tailored to an individual. And depending on the extent of the survey and what you want, you might need other kinds of software or resources for really comprehensive questionnaires. So there, you might have received surveys. There's lots of surveys going around right now that use Qualtrics, which is a data analysis software. And sometimes people even bring in consultants to help oversee a survey and analyze the results. So that can be expensive as well if you have to buy licenses. The next one that I still consider transactional is observation. And this is one that you probably do a lot of without really noticing that it's a data collection methodology or evaluation tool. And this is gathering firsthand information about how a program operates or its process. So the advantages are, depending on the kind of project you're evaluating, you can go firsthand, real time, observe what's happening in that program. So that can be relatively easy. And then it can be a really flexible method if your organization runs events, a series of events or series of activities that really, observing the event is really a good method to kind of get at how things are going. But because of that, the challenges are, again, time consuming. If there are lots of events and activities, having someone dedicated to going to them all and recording their observations. And depending on the program, it can also be difficult to interpret observations. The person observing might make notes that aren't exactly what you had in mind for them to notice, because there's that subjectivity there that you can't get around. And depending on how many observations and the kinds of tools used, it can be pretty complex to then present observations to a third party, to explain to someone why you chose that method and what results came out of it. And because you're sending someone in to observe, you can imagine that might actually influence the behavior or the operations of a program as well. I've done some evaluation for programs that involve teaching inside a jail or inside a correctional facility. And if you sent someone to observe a course or something happening, you can imagine how an outsider might influence the behavior of the participants in a way that would change the kinds of observations that you would get. All right, and then the last two on the next slide are more relational. And the first one is focus groups. So this is bringing together a number of people to explore a topic or talk about a program. And this would be a discussion with program participants. It might be different focus groups of stakeholders. So you could convene your staff, your board members, participants, community partners, as Suzanne mentioned above. Stakeholders is a really broad group of people. So you can do focus groups that are limited to one or more of those. The advantages to this are focus groups are great for evaluation, but also for marketing or use outside of a fundraising or grant seeking context. You get to know how large groups of people see your program or experience certain things, what they want out of it. So you can really get a lot of useful information that goes beyond the grant seeking process. You can have focus groups do double duty, where if you want to present program information to those stakeholder groups or to large groups, you can also use that time to present your own material while also getting feedback. So that's why focus groups can be really useful at all stages of a project. And you get collective impressions. This is where we get more into people's opinions and experiences and impressions rather than answers to specific questions. You can ask groups to share stories. The challenges with focus groups are, again, there's a difficulty in organizing and analyzing the responses. A transcript of a focus group could be incredibly lengthy and hard to organize different voices within a large group. You'll have to have a skilled facilitator, someone who is experienced in getting information out of a group of people and not letting conversations get too sidetracked or too individualistic in nature if you want to get kind of a collective impression. And there's obviously a scheduling challenge. Getting large groups of people together at the same time can be difficult, and logistically there are some hurdles. The last one is one-on-one interviews. So similar to focus groups, this is the purpose is to get stories and impressions, experiences and thoughts, but from individuals rather than a large group at one time. So the advantages of interviews are you can get a really broad range of both kind of statistical information, because you could have them do a checklist or a demographic section quickly and then go into getting more depth of information as well. And interviews, they are relational. They feel very personal. So you'll get a different kind of response from people who feel that you're reaching out in an individual way rather than an online survey or being asked the same questions as 100 other people. Challenges with a lot of these is time consuming. I think online Google Forms are the only ones that maybe are less time consuming. But this can also be potentially costly if you have to pay people to go out and do the interviews. Sometimes you can get that covered by volunteers or program staff, but it can definitely be costly and time consuming. And you have to come up with a strategy to analyze that information. How do you collect stories? And interviews are exactly the kind of place where you would explore how to take qualitative data and information and adapt it to being quantitative as well. And then, like observation, there you have an interviewer as well as an interviewee. And the interviewer, even if they're given a list of questions, is still going to bring their own bias into that conversation. If they're a program staff, they would have a certain, assumptions about the program. If you got an enthusiastic board member to go and do interviews, they would come at it with a different sort of set of interests and assumptions. So you're always going to be kind of dealing with that subjectivity. All right, so the next slide, data collection methods, what is the bottom line to those? The hope is that that gave you an overview of tools you might use. We can talk through specific resources for individual methods if you're interested in learning more about different kinds of the 6 that we went over. But the common denominator I just want to bring up again is that there's always going to be bias and subjectivity, even in our efforts to collect objective data. So there are always people involved, just like the numbers land heavily on bodies, as Ta-Nehisi Coates said. The way that we go about data collection also has biases and assumptions about that. To mitigate bias in data collection, you might think through using multiple methods. So not just online surveys, but also smaller focus groups, doing some case study work up front, and then doing interviews further on down after program implementation has begun. So there's ways to create a fuller picture by using multiple methods. Again, sort of thinking back to workshop 1 and some of those bigger picture assumptions within the grant world, don't forget about equity mindedness, right? Are we thinking about our evaluation tools in terms of assets or in terms of deficits? Is the way that we collect data really serving the population that you want to collect data about? Are you doing it in a way that makes sense? With access issues, there's internet, but there's also always language issues. Are things available in the languages that you really need to get a full picture of a program? This comes up at my organization a fair bit, where we always translate materials, or as much as possible, translate materials into Spanish. But we also have a significant population of students who speak Mandarin. So do we have Chinese materials available? So there's a lot of access issues to think about with data collection, because there might be blind spots that you end up missing if you don't think through those at the beginning. So again, with these assumptions, acknowledging the limitations of data and your experiences with data collection methods is something that you want to talk about with funders, talk about with each other. This is part of that larger conversation about really influencing philanthropy, is funders understanding that this piece is mysterious sometimes, it is difficult, sometimes it seems far too academic in a lot of grassroots organizing and social justice, social change movements. Academic is not helpful. It is not what's useful all the time. So continue to think about these things when you put together grant applications and when you put together evaluation, but also make it part of the conversation. When you write up a sustainability plan or an evaluation plan, be transparent about the limitations of your own capacity. Be honest about how great your population might be at producing qualitative data, maybe not statistical data, but value qualitative over quantitative in the way you present your work as well. Because again, like shifting the philanthropic needle broadly, this conversation is new, and it's going to take time. All right, so now we're going to shift a bit into looking at a particular tool, the logic model. And similar to evaluation and data conversations, I feel like logic models are often something people are either not at all familiar with, they've never been asked to produce one, or they've never seen one, or if they have heard of it, it feels a little complicated, or something that they don't really want to do. So before I dive into logic models, I just wanted to we're not going to do a full poll, I want to see in the chat box. Part of your homework was to see if you could locate some logic models in your area. So I'm curious to see if you just want to drop into the chat, yes or no. Yes, you were able to find logic models for something similar to your program, or no, you searched and you really couldn't find any. And we won't make you admit if you didn't do your homework this time. I just kind of want to get a sense of yeses or nos, if anyone was able to find things. All right, got at least one yes. Amy was able to find something. All right, Shakira was not. Yep, and good. You asked stakeholders and didn't get a response. Okay. LGBTQ, it wasn't easy to find ones in that area. All right. Yeah, thank you. The responded to that. I mean, that's interesting. I do feel like logic models they're not all that common, and certainly not in, I think, the kinds of work that a lot of you do. So for the most part, I've only ever been asked to produce logic models for federal grants. So federal agencies sort of long ago decided the logic model was a requirement. It was something useful for the people reviewing applications. So that's why they're not as common. If you look for logic models in the realm of health and human services, like houselessness and housing, a lot of environmental sort of climate change, you'll be more likely to find logic models in those areas. But part of the reason we really wanted to spend some time on logic models was if you can get comfortable with these, they can be an excellent tool for putting together grant applications, for figuring out evaluation questions, and then for really sort of checking on the status and the success of your program along the way. So I personally tend to put together logic models. I try to do it for almost every program I do a grant for, even if it's not required, because I think they're just such useful tools. So we hope after I give you an overview that you might try to produce a logic model for the work that you do, and then that in and of itself, we can hope there will be more examples available as more and more people use this tool. So there, on a simple level, a logic model is a semi-graphic summation of your program from start to finish. Within it encapsulates just about every toolkit component we've gone over in this workshop series. And it can end up being a bit of a visual evaluation plan as well. So what you're seeing on this slide is a really simple logic model template. So it includes inputs, outputs, and outcomes. And in these three categories, it's a distillation of your grant application or your program summary. And it can also, when we get to the outcome section, you'll see, can visually line up your theory of change. So if you've done your homework for the first 2 workshops, a lot of those pieces, like the outcomes worksheet that you created, your budget categories and activities list that are connected to budget items, those will be the things that you would use to just populate these columns on a logic model. So inputs, what the question there is what we invest. So what are you starting with? What is coming into a project? And that is everything from people to if there's time, volunteer time, money. The input column of a logic model for a grant application should include the money you're about to give me when you say yes to this grant application. And then it could be equipment, technology. If you're working in education, curriculum could, like existing curriculum could be an input, and any partners you have as well. Next column, or multiple columns depending, would be your outputs, and that is activities. What are you doing and who is doing them? So the participation in those activities. And then the outcome part of the logic model is everything we're talking about today, right? It's the, what is the impact? What does success look like? What are the goals and milestones of the program? So you'll often see on a logic model things separated into short, medium, and long-term outcomes. So back in workshop 2, Suzanne went through that when she talked about outcomes and milestones, and Jen's gonna mention it again a little later today as well. So you have, yeah, you've got this sort of simple, it's just usually lists or bullet points within these columns that give you a nice summation of your project. So I'm going to go through an example. I wish I had time to sort of either produce, if I couldn't find them, examples of ones from different areas for you, but as you identified, it's difficult to find them. If you do want to see more examples, I can send you ones that I've done. I've got a number for federal agencies, but I'd like to sort of build up more of a library of examples from other areas as well. So the example I'm just going to walk you through quickly is a logic model that we put together at Santa Barbara City College for an environmental protection agency grant. So we just received an environmental education grant. So in the inputs column, our logic model was 2 pages long. So I'm actually going to show you what page 1 looked like, and then the flip side. You can definitely condense it onto a 1-page as well. So the inputs for us were things, we listed financial resources because we had faculty time, we had foundation staff time, which was me, and there you see it, the EPA grant funds this request. And I also feel like that's manifesting positivity as well, right, in hopes of winning grants. But then we also had curriculum resources, existing sites and locations that we'd be working on. This is a community garden project that works with courses and students and faculty at City College. And then we had an expertise section, right? So our faculty, the curriculum, the community partners, and also grant management is listed there. So the person helping put this together and the person, or the team of people who will do evaluation. Those are all inputs at the beginning. Then activities are all of the activities on campus and off campus as part of this project. and different people. There's a lot of partners in this one doing different programming. And then we had a column of the participation and the audience. So who is leading it and who is attending. There's things like speaker series and public events and private events as part of this project. So that outputs is the activities part of your toolkit and who is participating. All right, next slide. And this is just the second one of this is our outcomes. So you'll see we have short-term, medium, and long-term. And short-term, one example is, we want to immediately increase engagement between things happening on campus and our community partners. And then the medium term would be establishing a network of partnerships that grows and shares resources. And then in the long term, if you think about like the theory of change, this is, ultimate behavior change, really long-term, big picture things where we want to see really fundamental change within the Santa Barbara community when it comes to making environmental decisions related to food production and consumption and gardens. So there's sort of this arc of outcomes that we drew up with this project. And then the section at the bottom, this is a part of a logic model that may not necessarily have a separate section of your application with the same title, but ultimately the indicators, which you'll see below, are just correlated with what's above them. So here are short-term goals. The indicators are how do we know we're actually working toward those goals. So if we want, our goal is to include partner relationships within coursework at City College. An indicator of that is, are the syllabi and course activities produced reflecting that? So you might see, I sort of put 3 Ds up here of what would be indicators. One would be deliverables, so creating new curriculum, or having students get jobs in certain industries. Then there's data, so qualitative or quantitative. What are the numbers that we expect out of the short, medium, and long-term outcomes? And then you'll also find in indicators examples of dissemination. So Suzanne mentioned in evaluation and sustainability, one of the things that's really important to funders is, are you producing a best practice? Are you doing something that can be replicable by another organization? And that's part of dissemination. And it could also be if you present your work at a conference, or if you have a network convening where you present the case study of your program, that would be you disseminating your results. So that's also something that's captured on a logic model. So the good thing about putting together short, medium, long term and arranging a logic model is that it also, much like a full cost budget that we discussed in workshop 2, a good logic model also shows a funder that you have a really good mastery of the full arc of a program or a project. And you can also demonstrate that not everything can happen in 1 year if you only get 1 year to do a grant. And then your sustainability plan takes into account how to see it through medium and then long-term change as well. So it's a really great tool to just sort of have, here is the summary of everything we already have, everything we want to do, why we're doing it, and how we're going to know that we're doing it. And it's, this is done in, it's not always this text heavy, but you're kind of distilling the application and the plan into these sort of bullet point lists on a table. Bottom line, I really love logic models, and I love including them in grant-seeking workshops because I really also think they're a great way to double check an application. So if I'm writing especially a large application, like a federal grant application, I will construct the logic model at the same time as I'm, writing the prose section of a narrative. And then it's a great way to go back and check, like, have I actually talked about all of these outcomes back in the narrative? Have I included all of the activities on the activity timeline? Is my budget actually, does it match up with the things that we say we're doing? So it's almost like producing a checklist for your application, to go back and kind of make sure all of it's coming together the way it should. So I would encourage you to try to produce a logic model for your organization, for your programs, even if it's a really broad, overarching, what are ultimately the goals, short, medium, and long term for our organization. It's just a really interesting practice, and it can help immensely with grant seeking. So with those tools in mind, I am now going to pass it over to Jen, who is going to kind of wrap this up with what it really means to demonstrate impact, and how this all comes together in sort of this last phase of grant seeking.
Thank you, Rachel, and Suzanne, for sharing information about why evaluation is important, and evaluation methodologies, as well as different tools and how we can use them. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about using your evaluation tools to actually demonstrate impact, and then I will talk about how you can apply this throughout the grants process. Next slide, please, Stanley. So you all should have received this handout, but this is a metric example worksheet from Manuel Pastor, and so that I don't butcher his little bio, I'm going to read it directly from my script. But Dr. Manuel Pastor is a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California, where he currently directs the program for environmental and regional equity and the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration, which is soon to be the Equity Research Institute. Manuel's research has focused on issues facing low-income urban communities and social movements that are seeking to change those realities. His most recent book is State of Resistance: What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Means for America's Future. Currently, he serves on the Governor's Recovery Task Force convened to help inform how the state can best address the concurring crisis we all face. So he's a very well-known sociologist. The fund often refers to his work, but that's a little bit about him. So in this worksheet that we have here, we can see how we can turn transactions into transformations. In other words, we can see how transactions, which would be our activities, can turn into transformations, which would be our impact. So for example, if we look at this first column, which is the organizing column, we can see that the transactions include activities, include door knocking, house meetings, phone calls, etc. And then we can see how the transformations or impact include depth of engagement, ownership of the organization and work. So then the question is, okay, how do you get from the transaction column to the transformation column? So from activities to impact. Next slide, please, Stanley. Alrighty. So a lot of it has to do with your program planning, your goals, your objectives, and your outcomes that you set in the beginning for your program. So we can refer to our logic models for our goals and what exactly it is that we are trying to demonstrate an impact on. We can then use our data collection tools to support our conclusions about our impact. So we will start with our program planning. we'll go next to our logic models, we'll go to the data collection tools, and then we'll help find our impact. One thing that I will note about logic models when Rachel was chatting about them is I included a tip and trick in the chat box, and it's that a lot of the times it actually helps to work backwards on your logic models. So you start with like what your intended social change or what your intended impact is, and then you work your way back through the logic model, and that actually really helps. And here on this particular slide, I have program planning, logic models, data collection tools, impact, but logic models inform your program planning. So you could have logic models prior to program planning, and your program planning, your logic models and your data collection tools are part of your program planning. Next slide, please. Okay, so as Rachel and I think Suzanne both mentioned, we have short-term impact, medium-term impact, and long-term impact. So for example, short-term impact is the change that will happen during or immediately following your program. You can measure this using short-term evaluation tools such as satisfaction surveys like Rachel mentioned. So for example, a satisfaction survey can include a question such as, after this program, I am more likely to. I am more likely to visit a health center. I am more likely to attend school every day. Whatever it is that your program seeks to measure, this is really good for measuring that short-term impact. Maybe you have a social emotional skill development program. I am more likely to speak up when something is wrong, or whatever it is, but that's going to measure a very short-term impact. In my personal experience, when I was doing evaluation, I would use this particular question to measure if folks were more or less likely to visit the health centers for Planned Parenthood, because I did this for Planned Parenthood specifically. So the way that we measured this at Planned Parenthood was we used a Likert scale to see how likely a program participant was to do XYZ. With this, we could then measure a change in intent or attitude. And then we could infer that this would lead to a behavior change moving forward. Even though we are able to infer that a change in attitude will lead to a change in behavior, we can't actually measure this without following our program participants for a longer period of time and measuring either a medium-term or a long-term impact. Next slide, please, Stanley. Okay, so long-term impact is the change that will happen over a period of time after your project has been implemented. You can measure this using long-term evaluation tools such as case studies or research studies, whatever you want to call them. But in a case study, you follow your program participants over a certain period of time following the program, and you measure their behaviors in the months following the program. This way, you can actually measure if a short-term knowledge or attitude change actually led to a long-term behavioral change. And here, you can also gauge where you are on your milestones within short-term, medium, and long-term outcomes. So you can also make inferences based on this long-term impact. Again, a lot of evaluation tends to be based on inferences that you can make, because obviously it's pretty hard to actually measure the long-term impacts or the broader social change that your organization is achieving. And that's one of the things that when we get into evaluation and into demonstrating impact, Rachel touched on this a little bit, but it's one of the areas where it's kind of inherently flawed in the way that foundations want to know about this stuff. because it's really hard to measure the social change that we're trying to achieve. And it's really hard to measure if social justice is actually happening. So this can help us measure some of the work that we're doing, but ultimately just know that even with all of these tools, measuring if your organization has actually done something to achieve social justice, or something to achieve a broader social change, putting it into like a beautiful little package, data package, and saying this is our impact is probably not likely. And your organization single-handedly probably will likely not achieve it either. It's, you know, a lot of collective work that goes into actually achieving social change and social justice. But with that being said, funders are still looking for ways in which you can demonstrate impact. And that's why we have these tools to help you kind of demonstrate different levels of impact within your program. Next slide, please, Stanley. So we do have this research study example, and this is an example, full disclaimer, that I have experience with. I, you know, in my work at Planned Parenthood, one of the programs that I often wrote grants for is Making Proud Choices, which is one of the programs that Planned Parenthood delivers. One of the things about this program that's really great is that it's an evidence-based intervention. So when the program was initially developed, the curriculum developers actually conducted a whole research study on their program to see what outcomes they got with the program. And as an evidence-based intervention, if whoever implements it next implements it with fidelity, then they should be able to achieve the same outcomes. So that's also another great way if you perhaps don't have the capacity to do a whole research study, but there's programs already out there that exist that are evidence-based, that you can replicate with fidelity. You can also show some impact there, because those already exist with the lens that if you do it like this, you will achieve this outcome. So this program was implemented in a small group setting with African American adolescents between the ages of 11 and 13. 659 youth were randomly assigned to receive one of 3 8-hour curricula, one being an abstinence curriculum, one being a safer sex curriculum, or a health promotion curriculum, which served as the control group, and then obviously one being the Making Proud Choices curriculum. The participants completed questionnaires before, immediately after, and 3, 6, and 12 months following the program. The primary measures were HIV risk-associated sexual behaviors. So some of the outcomes that came after this was after the participants who received the Making Proud Choices program, they reported more consistent condom use and less unprotected sex in the 3 months after the intervention than those in the control group, and a higher frequency of condom use at the 3, 6, and 12-month follow-up. Those who also participated in the 3, 6, and 12-month follow-up reported a higher intention to use a condom, less of a likelihood to actually engage in sexual activity. And so those are some really, really good measurable outcomes. And I don't have the data on like what that immediately after survey looked like versus the 3-month versus the 6-month versus the 12-month. But using those, you know, you can see, like, I'm not sure exactly if they all ask the same questions. But if I were to think about how I would structure this as an evaluator, I would probably do more like intent or attitude change in the immediate after survey. And then I would monitor more actual behavior change related to the attitude change from the immediate survey. And that way you can actually see if the attitude or knowledge change actually led to behavior change. So this is just an example, and you can look up relevant research studies for your whatever program you're doing or whatever type of work you're doing. And again, having evidence-based interventions is a great way to have a base of impact already, right? To inform your grant proposal and to be able to demonstrate that back to funders. Next slide, please, Stanley. Okay, so how do we apply impact throughout the grant process? So we added this slide because we were like, okay, we're talking about impact, we're talking about all this stuff, but how does it actually relate to the grant process? So in your proposal, if it's a new program, this might not be the case, but if it's an existing program, you can use previous impact to build up your need statement, to build up your value statement, and to build up your entire proposal. Sometimes funders will also ask, is this an existing or ongoing program? And if so, what have been some of your successes? What have been some of your challenges? And you can use the impact data, or the impact that you've inferred and some of your evaluation data to show the success of your program and help build your case for why they should support this program moving forward. When it comes to reporting, you can also use some of this information in your interim and final reports. I will say though that when it comes to reporting, a lot of the times funders want to know specific things on their report form. And so they will ask you a specific set of questions, and you can weave it into your responses, but sometimes there may not be a lot of room for actually demonstrating your impact. A lot of the times funders will ask for more quantitative data even than qualitative data. They'll ask for things like, how many participants did you reach? What were your successes? What were your challenges? Which sometimes those areas don't leave as much room for demonstrating your impact, but you can weave it into your narrative, or if there's any other thoughts section or any other comments or any other things we should know in reporting, that's a great place to put, we evaluated this in this way and found these outcomes, if none of the reporting questions leave you room to do that. But if the reporting questions do leave you room to do that, then I encourage you to include it in your reports. And then this also helps you within program planning so that you know and can make program improvements. Once you know kind of what worked, what didn't work, what outcomes you have, you can go back and, improve your program. And if your intended outcome on your logic model was one thing and you found that you weren't reaching that, then you can adjust your activities, you can adjust your outputs, and then that way you can see, kind of what worked and what didn't work. So that's how impact is often weaved throughout the grant process. But again, measuring impact can be difficult when you're working towards social justice or social change, right? Like when I write proposals for, Planned Parenthood, like our overall goal is to make sure everyone has access to healthcare, but we don't really have like a solid, legit way of measuring that. And that's really difficult for folks to measure. Or, like when I think about organizations that have like social, emotional cultivation for their participants, it's like it's made on an inference, right, that they'll be able to use these skills, but we don't actually have a way to measure, like unless we follow people throughout their whole lives, which would be very costly and might be a huge undertaking for nonprofits with small budgets. That might not always be feasible or possible. But generally, this is how you can use some of that impact to inform your grant writing, your reports, and your program planning. I will say that I was on a webinar recently It was actually a reproductive justice webinar with Sister Song, and they're actually doing a summer institute this week all on reproductive justice. So if anyone is interested, I encourage you to check it out. But one of the things that was shared during the webinar was that, you know, having funders want you to demonstrate specific sorts of impact or give you specific sorts of data sometimes can also be really problematic. And so this in this particular presentation, they got just a little bit into sharing how they had some issues with funders wanting them to show specific things or wanting them to not use specific language, and how they had to be like, we can't do that. Like, we are going to stick to what our mission is. And also them saying like, listen, like, you giving us the money instead of another organization, that's the social change, not like all of this other stuff that we can't demonstrate, like we can't solidly demonstrate. And that kind of goes back to what Rachel has been talking about with the whole trust-based philanthropy. But funders aren't quite there yet. Not all funders are quite there yet. And so I do encourage everyone in their grant writing and to what funders they're grant writing for, to not lose themselves to some expectation that the funder has. Government grants sometimes will put specific things that you have to do. But I encourage you all to make sure that none of the funding that you're applying for kind of goes against your mission, and that you have candid conversations with the funders about what's realistic and what's not, because funders do need to hear that the current whole grant mode and grant process is a little bit outdated and archaic, and is not actually in line with current social justice values. So that's just a disclaimer on my end, right? Like, the radical move isn't what you can show through your project, but the radical move is your grassroots program that actually engages the constituency getting access to this funding in the first place. So that's just like a total, I guess, kind of a disclaimer and an aside. But yeah, demonstrating impact can be difficult. I hope that you find ways using some of the tools that we've given to demonstrate it in your proposal. But just remember, a lot of it is based on inferences and what you can infer from this tool. And again, these are just tools. They have limitations, but I encourage you to use them as much as you can as we still continue to work through the current grant process. That's all from me on impact.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was, excuse me, such a wealth of information that you shared with us. And I'll go ahead and pass that on to, I believe, Rachel to kind of recap our session for today. Thanks so much, Rachel.
Okay, yes, sorry, I forgot I had another part. No, we just wanted to recap in terms of where we've been, workshops 1, 2, and 3 now under our belt. So we started with those big picture implicit rules of grant seeking. What are all the explicit rules to get our heads around before starting to put together the grant toolkit? So what are all those components coming together to create really good, solid, fundable proposals? And hopefully over the course of all 3, you've gained tools and resources that will help you do that. And then finally today, with conveying your impact on social change. So that's going to look different for each area and all of you, but we hope that we've sort of provided at least the starting point to really get all of those tools to work for your organization. So if you have, I think if you've been adding questions to the chat, Stanley's been collecting those. So now we'll have, a pretty decent amount of time for our last Q&A as we wrap up.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel, and to each of you. That was a wealth of information that be helpful for folks here and for folks who see our recording. So now let's go ahead and open it up to our participants and see what questions you have. It could be on evaluation, which we heard so much about today. It could be on any of the topics that we've covered so far, or anything that maybe we haven't covered. Just want to open it up and to our panelists. And I'll go ahead and just pass on one question that we had submitted from Shakira, who asks, have you found that state and federal grants are open to qualitative data development and reporting? So, and maybe, broadening that to kind of asking if there are kind of bigger trends in what types of data government grants, federal and state or local kind of tend to accept versus, let's say, foundation grants.
I think it's pretty common for funders to accept using what's called mixed methods. You can do qualitative and quantitative. And, I was going to add something to the qualitative component. If you're doing something like interviews, for example, one of the ways to turn that into quantitative data is to look for themes that emerged through the interviews. And you might then be able to say something like, 65 or 75% of the respondents reported that they experienced such and such. So you can report what it is they experienced in a qualitative way, and then give a number that indicates the strength of that theme, for example.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I completely agree. That's one of the, just having the number of surveys that you can, or interviews that you conducted, gives you a baseline number to sort of create a percentage. But we are wrapping up a USDA grant where we had, part of our evaluation was a survey, so a quantitative survey based on a USDA survey. And then we also did interviews. And so the evaluation component that talks about the interviews, definitely is very much qualitative. It's about the experience of students on campuses, accessing certain food security related initiatives. And that's actually going to get kind of more of the attention in the report, because that's exactly the qualitative data is what helps us prepare for implementation. It was a survey, research-based that then is going to roll into an implementation grant. So I think definitely, federal funders, I think they're interested in best practices. And I think it's up to us as funders to describe how qualitative data collection actually produces some really interesting best practices, especially when you're looking at equity, access, belonging. And I think, each sector probably has its own language around that, but I know in higher ed, ideas of belonging, have come up. There's so much new language now of how to talk about that in a way that sounds, I know it's sort of trying to fit yourself in, but it's, talking about things in a way that sounds scientific enough for a federal, a reviewer. And it's by, looking at affective learning techniques, mentorship programs on campus. All of those kind of interventions have given us language to use that federal evaluators have actually really, responded well to. So I think, like we've said throughout the whole workshop, telling your story about your work in a really transparent, honest, thoughtful way ends up, really producing, I think, good reports and good evaluation content. So
I would also add that, like, a specific example that I can give is, like, for example, when I was doing evaluation and we were doing surveys, one of the things that I would do was I would count up all my surveys. This was, I had like this crazy spreadsheet, and I like spreadsheets. But I had this crazy spreadsheet, and one of the things that I would do was I would count up everything, and then I would say 94% of survey participants reported this change in attitude or something like that. And that's a way to quantify your qualitative data, like a really simple example. Definitely you want to do that like continuously, and not wait until you do your evaluation of programming to do that, because then you'll have like 1,000 surveys to do that for. So your evaluator, whoever's evaluating your program, can set up mechanisms for your team tracking that automatically. And that's a really great way of quantifying some of that qualitative data.
Great, thank you so much. And so we had a question around from Shakira asking, I'm curious if presenters and or participants in this webinar are experiencing the need or a need to ask funders for more time to complete their programs, evaluation, or reporting in light of COVID. If so, what has been the general experience? And so I'll hand it off to our panelists, but for those of you attending, if you have experience with this, would love for you to weigh in the chat as well. Just to hear everybody's insight so far. And Sophia mentions that their personal experience has been that they've had to use different framing to illustrate the effects of COVID on reporting. So yeah, any kind of more real-time feedback on how funders are kind of changing their I guess reporting questions and how flexible folks are?
Yeah, I can start this one off. I mean, the springtime, the end of the fiscal year, the end of the academic year is a huge time for reporting. So COVID fell at precisely the time that I think grant writers and grant makers are all dealing with this. My experience here in Santa Barbara was almost wholly positive and flexibility from the grantors. Not everyone communicated as quickly, and often it was a responsive thing where I would need to reach out, whereas there were some funders who were more proactive about saying, hey, we know things are crazy right now, here's what we're thinking and what we're doing. But I would say at least a couple local funders specifically reached out and was like, hey, you're probably getting automatic notifications from our grant portal. Don't worry if don't worry about that deadline. We're actually happy to let you just submit a letter or an email outlining what's been going on for you and how it's affected your program. So that's, extra flexible. Just send us an email, let us know how you're doing. I had another one just the other day. I think it was a board member who's obviously on an outreach committee reached out directly to just see how we were doing, which that's awesome. Like that kind of proactive reaching out. I think another funder, we had applied for a grant that came in like late March or early April, and there was a little handwritten note on the award letter saying, we recognize this is a strange time. We gave you this money for this purpose, but if you need to use it elsewhere because of COVID, let us know. We're okay with that. That was really great flexibility. So I feel like locally, my experience has been really positive. Federally and statewide, it's been a little bit different. I had some not quite as positive experiences with a state agency that didn't really communicate very well on whether extensions were going to be possible.
Mhm.
And then when it came down to asking for an extension, they were like, oh, actually, yeah, we decided not to allow those. So your report is due tomorrow. And
Oh no.
yeah, and but ultimately, you know, they
Yeah.
I think they ended up allowing for some flexibility in how the remaining funds were spent, so it was okay. But
Mhm.
and then federally, the Office of Management, I always forget what OMB actually stands for. What's the B?
Management budget. I think.
Management
Office of
budgets.
Management
Yeah, that's
and
it. This is
Budget.
management and budgets. They released two very vague, interesting memos back in March that went out, and anyone who sort of had federal grants this year, those memos actually made it quite easy for us to reach out to program officers and say, not really sure, these memos weren't terribly specific, but it seemed like you're allowing for flexibility on how to spend remaining funds or access no-cost extensions. So with any federal grants I've been working on, those sort of blanket memos that came out of OMB, allowed us to actually get through budgetary line item changes with basically just an email, like emails to program officers to arrange for those being approved.
Right.
So I think that's mostly because federal agencies are so over impacted right now. They just want to
Right.
get things wrapped up in a lot of
Right,
senses.
right.
So that allowed some flexibility. That's been my experience. I don't know if Suzanne and Jennifer have different stories.
I haven't been grant writing recently.
I would say that when you're a grant writer, so when your organization has a grants person, a lot of the times, unless they're solely a grant writer where they just write your grant for you, but a lot of the times grant positions will include some sort of aspect of funder relation development. So you, as the person who's responsible for grants, will do funder cultivation essentially. And it's similar to how like a person who's a fundraiser, an individual for individual giving does donor cultivation, you do funder cultivation. So if funders host stuff in the community, you go and you attend and you network with the program folks and they get to know your face and stuff. And all of that is really important for if something goes on, you can easily reach out to these folks and they know who you are. A lot of the times, they don't want to have to take the money back from you. So a lot of the times, if you're encountering some issues with, specifically with community foundations, I don't know quite as much about government funders. The relationships are a little bit different with government funders. But with community foundations, you can easily reach out and they will let you know a little bit more. You can reach out to them, say, hey, I would love to check in with you about the program. A lot of the times they're really excited to learn more about the program. And you can give them more information on these are some of the challenges. When you do that, I will say one of the things that you can do and that you should do is focus on your adaptability and how you encounter these challenges and you adapted to them, what you did to adapt to them, and what that means for your organization, right? And sometimes, even though you don't have the ability to do a program, your costs for your staff don't go away, right? So you have to be able to convey, listen, our staff wasn't able to go out into the community because of COVID. So what we had to do was shift our staff time to developing virtual presentations. Maybe you had the opportunity to implement those, maybe you didn't. But you can talk about maybe what your COVID response looked like specific to COVID, right? But building those funder relationships, having someone, whether it's, a lot of the times folks wear many hats. And if you are one of the people that wears many hats, adding funder cultivation to your hat might be a good thing as well to help you develop those relationships for whenever anything like this comes up and happens.
And that relates to Sophia weighed in on this as a reflection, saying that, you know, it's interesting grant writing during COVID and incorporating sustainability to their current practices, you know, which kind of speaks to that focus on resiliency during these wild times. And hopefully funders are approachable to be able to communicate with, right? I mean, so often, unfortunately, philanthropy especially, and I'm sure there's a little bit of this challenge with government grants as well. It's like, you know, you're having to like hurl something over a castle wall, as my my former coworker would say, right? And so like it takes a lot of work on the part of the applicant or the grantee to like continuously work on building that rapport. And you know, so hopefully I think it's incumbent upon, you know, the funder, right, to make sure to maintain that relationship as best they can.
I also want to say one final thing about this whole presentation is that we're talking about demonstrating impact for your programs. And one of the things that we've also seen with COVID is that funders are really shifting to like capacity building, more gen op and not as much program. And so again, that's one of the places where demonstrating your organization's overall impact, again, like measuring social change or social justice is like, you can't neatly package that into a cute little gift box and give it to your funder, right? Like, so these are the places where we have to get a little bit more creative and say, okay, our overall goal is to ensure access to healthcare for everyone. We are attempting to do this, you know, by increasing the affordability of our health centers so that folks without insurance, you know, can access it, offering transportation stipends so that folks without, you know, access to transportation or money for transportation can still come to our health centers, offering telemedicine to remove some of those physical barriers again. And you can infer that by doing those things, you are working toward ensuring better access to healthcare for all people, right? Regardless of social determinants. But again, it's not going to be in a cute little box for your funder.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a really good point. And Suzanne and Rachel, anything else you want to add before we wrap up our series?
I mean, yeah, this has been great. I do feel like COVID and this year has given us a great opportunity to have different kinds of conversations with funders in general. And I actually, yeah, Jen, I hadn't thought about that point of like, that is true. Like I'm thinking through, you know, the flexibility of funders, and in that sense, they've been fine, some of them, with, you know, shifting program support into general operating support. And obviously with, you know, watching sort of the survival and the viability of different industries through this time, those are the conversations that are happening, right? And maybe like lots of other industries and sectors are exploring, you know, COVID, this year could be a jumpstart to conversations about how funders, you know, maybe general operating, right? That's like the biggest tenet of trust-based philanthropy. Maybe this is nudging people in that direction necessarily. So I think, yeah, if nothing else comes out of this, that's a great reminder Jen sort of leaves us with, is that remember that grant seeking, wherever possible, should still be relational. And if we can make it more like, I don't know, that first slide we talked about where individual giving is relational rather than transactional, that's going to help all the aspects of this, I think.
Great. Suzanne, anything else to add?
Not really. Everybody has spoken very well, and we've given quite a wealth of information across these 3 sessions. And now it's on all you folks to go out there and do it, right?
Right. The easy part.
Catch up on your homework.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of which, we will be updating. I'll be updating shared files that everybody should have received with some more additional resources that Rachel, Suzanne, and Jen prepared for us, including a list of terms and helpful tips and tricks, and the articles referenced here, as well as the slides and recordings. So I'll definitely make sure to send that out again and give you all an update. But thank you so much again to the three of you. I wish we were in a big room together so we could give you an actual round of applause. But really, I mean, it's been such a pleasure working with you, as I've shared, and I know that this is going to be helpful for, you know, the dozens of people who have joined us, but also many others to come through our recordings. And it's really, you know, it's a niche part of our ecosystem, you know, navigating progressive social change in the broader funding world, as we've talked about. So thank you to each of you again, and thank you again to Naida for your thoughtful interpretation of these sessions, as well as some of our materials. And thanks to everybody who joined us. Again, knowing many of you, I appreciate your work in the community. It's important and it's difficult at times, right? So want to thank you for that. So thank you, everyone. Speaking of evaluation, I should add our topic for the day. We'd also really appreciate you giving us your feedback about our workshops, taking our 2-minute Google Docs survey, which now I'm going to overthink and rework probably. So yeah, so please take a second to fill that out. So again, we're going to wrap it up, but just want to end with just a note of gratitude. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Bye, y'all.
everybody.